You're watching Saturday Anime on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Greetings, this is Reverend Paul, and this is the Studio Chōjin YouTube channel. The video I'm about to introduce is actually an excerpt from my Bennett the Sage is Wrong Part 2 video. Way back when, I did a response to what I believe is a terrible video, Bennett the Sage's review of Akira. I did a response to his review. In that response video, I did my own little analysis of the Akira film. And I thought it would be pretty cool if I just cut that part out and I released it as its own video. That way people who don't care about Bennett the Sage can check out the analysis and you could have a Bennett-free experience, which is pretty fucking cool. I think there's one part in this video where I mention Bennett very briefly, but trust me, this video is just analysis of Akira. And if you are somebody who is a subscriber to this channel and you've seen this video and you're disappointed, don't worry, because there's a brand new mailbag segment at the end of this video. Just click the link in the timestamp and it'll take you right there. And at the end of this video, during the wrap up, I talk a little bit about next week's video and a couple of future videos. So without any further ado, please enjoy this analysis of Akira. I've spent a lot of time talking about the plot, but what are the themes of Akira? Well, like a lot of other anime from the 1980s, and similar to the aforementioned Grave of the Fireflies, Akira is the product of post-World War II sensibilities. The film begins with a massive explosion destroying Tokyo, and throughout the film, people mention the Great War Japan has just recovered from. In all of his bitching about the plot of the film and jokes about the dubbing, Bennett has completely missed that Akira is an allegory for post-World War II Japan. The labor strikes and student protests in Akira mirror the reaction to the real-life Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the United States and Japan, which was first signed at the San Francisco Presidio in 1954, then amended in 1960. The treaty said any attack against Japan or the US that happened in a Japanese territory under Japanese control would require action from both the United States and Japan. When the treaty was enacted, student groups and labor unions took to the streets to protest because they feared the treaty would lead to more hostilities against Japan in East Asia and could be the start of more Japanese militarism and imperialism. These concerns are echoed in Akira, with protesters holding signs that specifically say oppose imperialism. In 1964, Japan was selected to host the Summer Games in Tokyo. The hosting of the Olympic Games was seen as Japan's re-emergence to the world stage and showcased Japan as a future world power. This idea is once again present in Akira, with the Olympic Games being mentioned several times throughout the film and the Olympic Stadium serving as the location for the film's climax. Neo Tokyo is very much a stand-in for 1960s Japan. With all of the post-war symbolism, it becomes very clear Akira is commenting on life after war, and maybe even more importantly, it's commenting on the nature of war itself. But what is Akira saying about war? On the surface, one would assume Akira is an anti-war film, in the vein of Grave of the Fireflies. After all, a government experiment that unlocks ultimate energy and leads to the destruction of a Japanese city is very much analogous to the atomic bomb attacks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that's only part of the story. The other important part is Tokyo is rebuilt into Neo Tokyo, then destroyed again for the exact same reason. Rather than looking at war as an evil that should be avoided, Akira the film and Akira the manga see war as an unavoidable mechanism for change. In the world of Akira, the violence of war and the aftermath of war is very much a symbol for the death of the old and birth of the new. In other words, Akira views violence as a necessary byproduct of the endless cycle of life. Tokyo is destroyed, then reborn as Neo Tokyo, then it's destroyed again. In the film, even the character Akira dies with the destruction of Tokyo, but is reborn with the destruction of Neo Tokyo. I mentioned earlier that I don't really look at Akira the film as an adaptation of the manga, and more as a different take on the same story, and I feel this idea is exemplified with the character of Akira himself. In the manga, Akira is someone who has unlocked ultimate power and has become consumed by that power. Akira in the manga is a shell of his former self, but he's also very much alive. alive. Akira in the film is dead. In fact, I've always thought Tetsuo's fate in the film was the same fate suffered by Akira 30 years earlier. When Tetsuo has visions of Akira and visions of his organs spilling out, it's no coincidence we see these images in succession of each other. Because this moment is not only foreshadowing the climax of the film, it's also flashing back to the unseen past of the film. It stands to reason, like Tetsuo, Akira awakened to ultimate power, couldn't control that power, exploded, and all that was left of him were some of his organs. Tetsuo's journey in the film is simply another part of the endless cycle of death and rebirth. Akira and Tetsuo are the same. They've gone on the same path, and that's why Tetsuo is so drawn to Akira. Unlike the manga, Akira the film spends less time focusing on the theme of death and rebirth as it pertains to politics and religion, and mainly focuses on death and rebirth as it pertains to the individual, specifically Tetsuo. Tetsuo is reborn several times throughout the course of the film. Tetsuo goes from being a shy kid to a destructive psychic to god of his own universe. The symbolism of Tetsuo appearing as a giant baby before he's absorbed into the energy ball shouldn't be lost on anyone. Interestingly enough, the stages Tetsuo experiences through the course of the film is very much a mirror for the stages and individual experiences through the course of a life. In the beginning of the film, Tetsuo's shy and he rides his bike with Kaneda's gang. Tetsuo and the others spend most of their time fighting with the clowns, living a life free of responsibility and consequence. This is very much Tetsuo's childhood phase. The bikes are nothing more than big toys meant to be played with, and the fights with the clowns don't have any repercussions. Nobody worries about the consequences of crashing their bikes or smashing someone over the head with a club, because from their point of view it's all a big game. However, childhood cannot last forever, and Tetsuo's childhood dies when he encounters Takashi on the highway. From this point on, Tetsuo is reborn into his teenage years. When the psychic powers awaken in Tetsuo, he becomes brash, rebellious, and prone to emotional outbursts. The Colonel serves as a father figure trying to rein in Tetsuo's actions, but Tetsuo doesn't listen because he thinks he knows better. Even the psychic children serve as a great symbol for teenagers, because what is a teenager other than an old child? Ultimately, Tetsuo is unable to control himself and self-destructs, leading to the violent end of his teenage years, giving the impression the only way to destroy teenage nihilism is through total self-destruction. It's at this point at the end of the film, Tetsuo is reborn as a god, which could be looked at as a symbol for his adulthood. In this incarnation, Tetsuo is calm, reserved, presumably wise. He has now successfully transitioned from an innocent child to an out-of-control teenager, and now finally to a calm and collected adult. Each time Tetsuo transitioned to a different stage, it happened violently. First with the explosion of his bike, then through the destruction of his physical body, reinforcing the idea rebirth is only possible through violent annihilation. Now, to be fair, this is just one interpretation of one specific aspect of the film, but the idea of death and rebirth can be applied to every aspect of the film. For example, Neo-Tokyo itself is caught in violent uprising. The government is overthrown in a coup d'etat, and the government officials are all killed. Also, the film begins and ends with the destruction of Tokyo. All change in Akira happens violently, leading one to draw the conclusion Otomo is suggesting the only way to save a society is to destroy it and to start all over. This week's question comes from the Autist Whisperer, who asks, what's your thoughts on modern anime? I think there are still good shows and movies, but they have a lack of grit compared to 80s and 90s anime. Is this due to demographics or industry changes? And what could be done to improve it? You know, I have spent a lot of time thinking about this. As somebody who's a fan of old school anime, I have spent a lot of time thinking about the differences between old school and new school anime. New school anime is certainly different than old school anime, and I think there are two big reasons for that. The first reason, which is the obvious reason, is the move to digital animation. Back in the 80s, back in the 70s, everything was done on cel with acrylic paint and ink. And today, everything is done digitally. And when you paint things digitally and when you animate digitally, you have a lot more options, especially in the coloring. You can do much more detailed rendering. A lot of modern anime has a lot more gradients to them. A lot of the backgrounds feel much more rendered. I mean, they're not photorealistic, but they are stylized paintings that have a much more rendered, painted feel to them. And obviously, with traditional media, you are limited. And even though traditional media is limited, I actually think those limitations end up working in its favor, because the cel-shaded style, especially when it's used with inks and cross-hatching, really creates a textile feel. So I think that is one big difference with the style. The other big difference is in content. And a lot of anime today doesn't feel like like it's as edgy as old school anime. It doesn't feel like it has the same amount of gratuitous sex and violence. And I think the reason for that is because back in the 80s and back in the 90s, the Japanese OVA market was really big. The stereotype of anime back in the 90s, the Japanimation days, was that Japanimation was ultra-violent porn cartoons. And the reason for that is because of the Japanese OVA scene. Japanese OVAs are incredibly violent, they are incredibly sexual, and they are awesome. And what a lot of people kind of forget about Japan, I think a lot of Westerners, is the fact that Japan is not the wild, wild west. I mean, in some ways they are more conservative than America. Famously, Japanese porn censors the genitals. That's something they don't do in American porn. And even though Japanese TV isn't as restrictive as American TV when it comes to nudity and violence, they do have restrictions. And the thing about OVAs was OVAs were not restricted. They were direct to video. The filmmakers can do anything they wanted to do, and that's how we got stuff like Urusuke Doji or The Guyver. The fountains of blood that people think about from anime like comes from those OVAs. When the OVA scene died, when home video died, that's when you stopped seeing all those like really ultra violent and those really kind of ultra sexual animes. That to me is the big difference between modern anime and old school anime. There's the stylistic change with the hand-drawn animation, and then there's kind of the content change with newer anime not being as over the top as old school anime when it comes to sex and violence. And what could be done to fix this? Well, first thing, the stylistic change, there's nothing stopping studios from just coloring things in an ink and paint style. I remember seeing a Reddit thread where people were arguing about this, where they were like, is it possible to color things digitally to make it look like acrylic paint? And the answer is yes. You can do anything with digital. That's why digital is awesome. You just have to limit yourself to doing a specific style. And an anime that comes to mind is Megalobox, where they limited themselves to kind of an old school style, and it works. That show looks great, even though it's a modern anime. Well, I think a key detail of a lot of old school anime, especially when you look at the backgrounds, is they look like colored ink drawings. A lot of times they have like a watercolor feel to them. And a lot of modern anime, I think it feels overly rendered, where it's not photorealistic, it's still stylized, but it is very, very rendered. And that's kind of like what almost makes like newer anime feel a little too perfect, where it doesn't have that grit. Whereas when you could see ink lines or you could see watercolor stains on the paper, that's what gives old school anime that grit. And you can do that digitally. They just don't. I don't know why they don't. And the other issue is obviously content. Is new anime going to get as extreme as old school anime? Yeah, look, there's always going to be somebody out there doing something crazy. I mean, we already saw Redo of Healer was a very like, you know, sleazy kind of ultra sexual anime. I thought the anime was kind of mediocre, but I liked the fact that it was bringing kind of like the sleaze back into like hentai, you know, kind of, it's bringing that kind of like pervy fucking sex horror shit back into anime. I thought that was cool. I'm sure down the line there'll be more animes like Redo of Healer. There'll be more animes that are more extreme with sex and violence. I don't think that stuff will ever go away. It'll probably never be to the degree it was in the 80s and 90s. I don't know, maybe that'll change with like indie creators. Like look, as an independent fucking comic book artist, I'm doing my best to produce crazy shit. So who knows, maybe there'll be an independent animation studio out there that'll figure out a way to make money off of streaming, and we'll have a second rise of the OVA market. Who knows? I mean, especially as software gets cheaper, I mean, you think it's gotta happen at some point. It seems like right now the only people that are making money off of streaming are the big companies. It seems like unless you have a huge catalog of IPs to throw up on a streaming service, streaming is not very profitable for people. So I mean, that is the big problem standing in the way with a direct video market. But you never say never, and especially with crowdfunding, and as a lot of these fandoms are becoming more and more niche, I think anything is possible. There's a good chance we'll be seeing more independent studios taking more risks with releases. I hope that answered your question. Thank you, Autist Whisperer, for sending in a question. If you have a question and you'd like to hear me answer it on a future edition of this program, send me an email at studiochojin@gmail.com. Make the subject raw, and I will be happy to respond to your question. So this wraps up the first best of edition of Studio Chojin. I'm sorry that I didn't produce a full brand new video. I was a little behind this week, and I figured this was a good opportunity right now to re-release my Akira analysis. I've been meaning to do that for a while, so I thought that would be pretty cool. Studio Chojin will be back back next week. We are going to be talking about Gunbuster, and I'm going to put off the Jushin Liger video. I'm going to put it off one more week again, because after we talk about Gunbuster, we are going to be talking about the Blue Girl, one of my favorite hentais. After the Blue Girl, we will get to Jushin Liger. So plenty of awesome stuff coming up in the next couple of weeks here at Studio Chōjin. And thank you for checking out this video. And once again, this is Reverend Paul saying, until we meet again.